So thank you for joining us today. Our 3 o'clock program is on AI, the Undiscovered Country, an overview of AI law and how to integrate ChatGPT in your workflow. We're delighted to have Mark Hogue from Mark Hogue Law, and introducing Mark will be Nestor Snaze from Snaze Law. Let me thank our partnering bar associations for this conference: Alameda County Bar, California Women Lawyers, Marin County Women Lawyers, the San Francisco Bar Association of San Francisco, the Marin Trial Lawyers Association, and the Santa Clara Bar Association. And special thanks to our MCLE conference committee members, Scott Buell, Atosa Fullerton, Morgan Daly, Nestor Snaze, Alex Vidot, and me. So I want to give special thanks to our event sponsor, Buell Law and Mediation, Chris Fowler Kirby, family law attorney, Cobblins Patch, Duffy and Bass, Farella Braun and Martel, D. Martini Walker and Gotti, Hanson Bridget, Leuzzi Murphy Solomon Churton Hale and Winnett, a personal injury law firm, Mary Sackett, Resolution Remedies, Tyson and Mendez, Wasatch, Hilly, and Fullerton, and our annual sponsors at the gold level, Chris Henry with Estate and Investment Realty Group, a certified probate real estate specialist, and at our silver level, Rifkin Law and Mediation, Williams and Gumbiner, Epstein Holtzapfel Christo, Strict Injury Law and Mediation, Huma Rasuli, a reverse mortgage specialist with Mutual of Omaha, McCarthy and Moe Group, Sternberger ADR Solutions, Leuzzi Murphy Solomon Churton Hale and Winnett, and at our bronze level, the Marin Bail Bonds. And with that, I'd like to now introduce Nestor Snaze. Nestor has a personal injury law practice devoted to litigating claims against large corporations, government entities, and insurance carriers. So in addition to his law practice, Nestor makes time to give back to the community through professional organizations, local government, and volunteer work. He has served on the boards of the Marin County Bar Association and Marin Trial Lawyers Association. He is now currently serving on the City of Novato's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission, using his experience with how things can go horribly wrong to push for improvements to the city's infrastructure. So take it away, Nestor.
Great. Thank you, Mimi, and welcome everyone. A little housekeeping first. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to move a little quickly with my introduction. If you have questions during the presentation, please post them in the chat, and I'll do my best to bring them up for discussion. And now I'd like to introduce Mark Hogue, a California-based attorney with a specialization in artificial intelligence and law, including generative AI, copyright, and ethical issues. He counsels technology startups in everything from formation to funding their enterprise and much more. His career path is fascinating. Mark studied economics at UCLA before going to law school. He describes himself as a serial entrepreneur, having founded many tech companies himself, and that background has shaped a really unique law practice. Perhaps most impressive, Mark is generous with his time and his talent by educating others about his practice expertise. He's hosted the top-ranked 199-episode podcast, Autonomous Cars with Mark Hogue, which is excellent. You can find episodes on YouTube, and I highly recommend that you do. He's also presented several MCLE lectures on AI and copyright law, and lectured at Columbia University's Executive LLM program. So now we'll imagine a rousing round of applause as we welcome Mark Hogue.
Well, thank you, Nestor, and Mimi, obviously, for the warm welcome. It's pretty great to give this lecture in my home county of Marin. I am from Mill Valley, so this is quite an honor indeed. So thank you very much. Let me, is this going back to full screen for you? I don't believe it is. Let me try that again.
So
I'm getting
your
that.
co-host, great. All right.
There we go. Are we good?
Yes.
All right, then. So I'm going to very promptly dive in because we do have, I think it's 80 slides or so. We can skip over this thanks to Nestor's wonderful intro. We are going to do a bit of background on what ChatGPT is and indeed, generative AI generally, I say a bit of background because, in my opinion, it's really impossible to explore and understand the law without actually understanding the technical underpinnings of what generative AI is and how it works. Don't worry, it's not going to be a super deep dive in a technical engineering sense, but it will be sufficient to grasp how it works. We'll do the best we can to dive into everything there is about copyright law as pertains to AI. We'll touch very briefly on patent law, software code, the EU, AI Act, terms of use, and of course, some ethics as pertains to all things with AI, which of course is all new, right? And finally, we'll wrap things up with a bit of discussion how to integrate all this new technology into your law practice, and crucially, obviously, how not to do so, which again kind of ties everything full circle to the various AI ethical implications and considerations, of which there are, well, a lot. And time permitting, I really do like to close out with a bit of discussion on what this kind of means for the future of not just law, really, but, well, everything, because there's a lot of big unknowns, a lot of uncertainties, and frankly, a lot of perceived very real existential risks, as you may have heard by now. Quick caveat that I love to give, there is no way to deep dive on all of this in 60 minutes, so sorry for that. I will therefore be skimming over a lot of kind of non-substantive or indeed even less substantive slides. You may already see, I think, in the deck that I've presented in the course materials, a few bits of grayed out content. You'll understand why as we start to fly through this. And yeah, I don't have all the answers to everything here. I mean, nobody does. The whole reason you're going to find, frankly, vastly more experienced attorneys than I debating so many of these issues is precisely because it is very, very unsettled, including and especially with respect to the intersection of AI and copyright. But that said, let's dive in and get started. Some of you may have made the connection to the title of this lecture, The Undiscovered Country. Obviously, it's originally from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. Of course, the reference was to the afterlife. Then, of course, Chancellor Gowron in the 23rd century reiterated this with respect to peace with the Federation and the Klingon Empire. And now the big question, of course, is this uncertainty with all things involving generative AI in our real lives today, because make no mistake, what was just science fiction as of November 29th last year, well, suddenly became very much our reality as of the 30th of November. So let's do this. What is ChatGPT? So first and foremost, ChatGPT is a product by the company OpenAI. That's the product name. Generative AIs in general are LLMs. No, not that kind. They are large language models, which we're going to unpack in a lot of detail in a bit. GPT in ChatGPT means generative pre-trained transformer. Also not that kind of transformer. So generative means that the model generates outputs like text or indeed even like images, videos, or pretty much any file type rather recently. It's pre-trained in the sense that it's been literally trained on large amounts of data, whether it's text, music, images, videos, and so forth. And then it produces a set of parameters. These are sort of rules about the language during this training process. The transformer basically is a term that means that the model is using this architecture type, which can recognize the context in which it's communicating. And in this way, it can consider the context of each word, and so it knows what word should follow next. We're going to unpack this a lot more a bit later. So the output and indeed the input is natural language text. So this isn't something like, as many of you have certainly experienced by now, it's not like querying Google or, say, doing a Lexis or Westlaw bit of legal research where you use all sorts of Boolean operators. This really truly is natural language. And indeed, if you're using, say, the iOS app, I think even the Android app, whether it's for ChatGPT or, say, HeyPi, another competing AI product, you can now speak in perfectly natural, normal, organic voice, decidedly not the sort of stilted way with which we speak with Siri, and it'll understand you perfectly. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Is it superhuman cognition? No, not yet. And I don't mean that tongue-in-cheek. That not yet time frame, as we'll see, has been rapidly reduced. And no, it's not really sentient, not yet anyway. But again, rapidly shrinking timeline. So what can it do? Well, a lot, really. And it's an ever-growing list of things. I don't want to just bore you by reading off bulleted lists of items, but suffice to say, it can indeed communicate in pretty much any language you can imagine. Yes, even Klingon. It creates original content. This is the stuff we're going to unpack much more deeply later on. And of course, from the very beginning, it's also really astonishingly good at writing code, whether it's HTML, JavaScript, C, C++, what have you. It's astonishing at this. And indeed, many new products now actually leverage that directly. Yes, of course, it's capable of passing the bar exam in the 90th percentile. It's very, very good at pretending, simulating, role-playing types of things. I'm partially flying through this because I do, again, suspect that many of you have already played around with it to a certain extent by now. So therefore, you probably also know the extent to which generative AI can be used is pretty broad indeed. I mean, there's sort of no end to which this can be applied. Obviously, there's a lot of shortcomings. I should say to the, I like to often quip that this presentation is outdated the day after I make it. That's not entirely hyperbole. For instance, it is certainly the case now that almost every iteration of generative AI available now does do live internet queries. The distinction being that originally when ChatGPT launched, it was sort of cut off at a knowledge cap. I believe that was September of 2021. So anything that you were asking it more recent than September 21, it couldn't give you an answer because it could not browse the internet. Now, of course, that is a capability. Obviously, there's the big issue of copyright infringement, which we'll be discussing. There's certainly this big concern, a very valid concern about hallucinations, which is sort of the the unfortunate undesired result where output is just fabricated by accident. There's profound implications around data privacy and ethical concerns. I just tossed this in here because nobody really talks about it. There is a very real energy concern too. We're obviously not going to get into this, but just FYIs, just so you know about it. The thermal cooling requirements for the supercomputers to do this stuff results in an extraordinary amount of water, like fresh water, to do the thermal cooling. This is something that's really not discussed anywhere, but now you know it. I've said it, we'll move on, but just do keep that in mind. It's something I think really needs to be at least addressed at some point. And obviously there's a huge issue around the transparency on self-learning. So just to kind of drive this point home, and I think hopefully to give you a bit of goosebumps crawling up your neck. So the leading AI researchers in the world do not know how to explain, they cannot explain the speed with which generative AI has suddenly improved. And with specificity, they cannot explain, for instance, how and why it is that ChatGPT can speak, say, for instance, well, Klingon or Farsi. These are not things that it was trained on, and nobody knows how and why it learned. So this is pretty mind-blowing stuff. So let's start little by little peeling back the onion peel of how all this works. And I really urge you to stick with this, because if you already know it, well, great, this will reinforce it. Or alternatively, you can frankly reach out and let me know if I got something wrong, right? Alternative, because this is pretty complicated stuff. Alternatively, if you don't know it, it's really, really important to try to understand it, because again, it's necessary to understand how to apply the law, right? So the best word choice that I've discovered that explains how generative AI works is that it's a next word predictor. I'm going to illustrate this later, but suffice to say, that is literally what it's doing. It's predicting the probable next word. Excuse me. I like to describe it too as a probability word cloud. To put things in perspective, ChatGPT 3, which came out in November of last year, the large language model for that had something like 175 billion parameters. Parameters are not the amount of data that were scraped from the web. Treat that as more or less of a constant. In all cases, they scrape everything there is out there, Wikipedia, Reddit, what have you, right? And then the language model that's generated can eventually end up being, this big, 175 billion parameters, or many times larger still, 100 trillion parameters in the case of ChatGPT 4. rumor just came out that ChatGPT 5 should be ready sometime next year. And in the words of Sam Altman, the CEO and co-founder of OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, ChatGPT 5 is likely to make ChatGPT 4 look quaint. Those are his words. So in any event, the parameters of the so-called learned rules and probabilities derived from the training data. So what this means is, and we're going to, again, unpack a lot of this shortly, the actual training data itself is never used. So to be clear, when you ask a question to ChatGPT, it's not like Googling something or punching in a Boolean search into, say, Lexis or Westlaw. There is no querying of an index which is occurring, right? So that training data is never even touched. We'll get more into this in a bit, I promise. But the end result is, the point is that the output that then results is truly novel. It's not pulling stuff out of some index the way that Google does when you Google something, which is literally pulling stuff out of an index. This is not doing that. It's creating stuff totally from scratch based on what it's learned previously. As far as live internet queries, because we discussed a moment ago, now generative AI can in fact do live internet searches. Let me just hold off on this until a bit later, but suffice to say that too is being routed back into the model and is also not being pulled verbatim, but we'll get to this in a bit. I dropped this in here more just kind of FYI. If you really want to understand the difference with what parameters are, give it a read. Jan LeCun is one of the leading AI researchers. I'm not going to go through this now, but do give it a read if you're interested. This graph, all you need to take away from it is taller is better. And these are various exams that ChatGPT now dominates on. On the left, you've got the bar exam. On the right, you've got AP Calculus, and it's just pretty mind-blowing stuff, right? One of the questions is kind of how and why is there suddenly such an improvement in AI technology? So just to be super clear on something, the idea of generative AI is actually not a new thing. So it's been in development. Well, let me back up. AI itself has been around in some form or another for decades. Generative AI is more relatively recently new a thing, but the speed with which it's been improving has exploded for this very reason. So this chart, it's a logarithmic chart, and what it's showing is the amount of compute power being dumped into AI training. So as you can see quite plainly, up until about, I don't know, 2014 or so, the amount of compute power was roughly doubling every 2 years. And then all of a sudden, just like that, we're doing 10x every year. I mean, this is staggering stuff. I am sure by now many of you have seen this chart, so I won't bore you explaining it, but suffice to say, ChatGPT is the fastest thing ever in human history to reach 100 million MAU, monthly active users. Just 2 months versus, say, TikTok, which took just a glacial 9 months in comparison. That's not what's mind-blowing. Here's what's truly mind-blowing. So if you look at all these products, these are all social apps, right? And by virtue of being social apps, this means that they benefit, and indeed they require, so-called network effects. So network effects, if you're not familiar with the term, it just simply means that the utility of a thing, of a service, of a product, or whatever, increases geometrically with the additional number of users utilizing that same service, right? So for instance, if you are the only user on, I don't know, Instagram or Facebook, it doesn't really offer you any value. I mean, I suppose you could use it for some personal diary. Okay, but putting that aside, the social utility of that thing increases literally exponentially the more users are on board, right? So there's an incentive for more and more users to get on, and for more and more users to invite yet more users on board. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, one of the early milestones for Facebook back in the day was every user had to bring on board with them 7 additional new users. If they could achieve that sort of growth, they would succeed. And indeed, of course, they did. Here's the point. ChatGPT is by its very nature decidedly not a social app. In fact, it's the exact opposite of a social app, right? So the fact that it grew this quickly in the absence of any network effects to accelerate its growth is, I don't have a sufficiently strong bit of hyperbole, but a superlative to describe this, but it's completely unthinkably mind-blowing. Let's just leave it at that. So obviously, I want to get this out of the way real quick. Is AI going to take somebody's job, your job, my job as lawyers, anyone's job, right? I don't know. Look, history is obviously full of plenty of examples, right, of new technologies displacing jobs. I mean, it's not like we have a bunch of blacksmiths making horseshoes anymore either, is it? But that said, I think there's two ways you can look at AI, right? It's either going to be what I call a utility multiplier, where in the case of one company at least, Freshworks, they produce help desk software for websites. They were able to cut coding development time from 9 weeks to just days, right? So they didn't fire people, but they made every person just 9x-ish more productive, right? But of course, there's a very real risk too that AI could be a human replacer. And indeed, the counterpoint to the example I just gave is a company called Octopus Energy. I believe they're based in the UK. They used ChatGPT to slash a whopping 250 jobs. 250 employees are just gone. Now, I suspect that these were, I mean, not to minimize the role by any means, but I suspect that these were help desk support. I do not know. I'm just totally guessing here. And that wouldn't really surprise me because the degree to which something like generative AI, like ChatGPT, can indeed do that sort of work really, really well, I mean, it makes sense. I'm not assigning a value judgment to this. I'm just saying that objectively, this wouldn't surprise me. So, but look, net in the big picture, I don't think AI is going to take your job yet. Rather, the bigger concern is that humans with AI are for sure going to take your job. You, lawyers, engineers, writers, anybody and everybody who's not utilizing this new technology is going to lose their job very, very soon indeed. I mean, a somewhat almost quaint, silly analogy is imagine, I don't know, the early days of the PC or the internet itself, email, right? Not only would you not be able to do your job competently and efficiently, but you'd basically just fall behind entirely. You would never be able to even hold a job or get a new job if you didn't have those skill sets. And indeed, as we'll touch on at the end here, there's actually a presumption imposed by the ABA ethics rules that lawyers maintain competent and efficient. And guess what? That's going to require knowing how to use these skill sets going forward. So yeah, the lack of knowledge of AI will absolutely cost your job eventually, and much, much sooner than one might anticipate. I will toss in a nice little footnote here that there is also a new field of jobs, prompt engineering, which is sort of what it sounds like. It's sort of a delicate science and art of how best to, well, craft the prompts, the natural language prompts to generate the output that you want. And that's a pretty cool field indeed. I say pretty cool. There's a lot of companies now that are paying something like $200,000 and $300,000 and up per year just for people to do this. It's pretty staggering stuff. But all right, look, that's kind of the, I guess, the framework for what there is to discuss about how generative AI works. We're now going to dive into kind of the substantive legal aspects of all this. Yes, as I said, I've kind of crossed out various things because there just isn't enough time. And frankly, there isn't enough substance on this yet. So let's just kind of fly through these. This is the kind of alphabet soup of stuff. We don't have anything here at the federal level yet with respect to AI as a whole. There've been a bunch of initiatives. Again, you've got this in your course materials. You can read through it and research it further if you'd like. I just don't think it makes sense to get into this now. States have done a few things that are rather interesting, but in general, unless I'm missing something, most of it seems to be based on privacy type things as pertains, for instance, to facial identification and so forth. There's a very real concern with using AI for identification, for hiring purposes and so forth, because there's a very real and valid risk with AI with respect to things like bias, which then raises a huge can of worms, obviously, with ethics generally. So again, feel free to read through this, but there's just not enough to really dive into this. And in any event, we wouldn't have the time. What we do have the time for, what we are primarily here for, there is copyright law, which suddenly became this really cool space. So let's just kind of recap again very briefly, right? So LLMs, large language models, are a type of generative AI. It's generative, it's pre-trained, it's a transformer, it's a next word predictor from a probability word cloud. So let's illustrate what this really means. And here's how it works. So based on the context, you're chatting with ChatGPT and it wants to output a response to to you, to some query that you've made. And so it wants to say, you know, the cat sits on the blank. What is the cat sitting on? Well, I mean, I guess it could be the cheeseburger. It's cute and it's certainly funny, but given the context of most ordinary conversations, it's probably not the likely outcome. Does the cat sit on the piano? Well, having grown up with cats and pianos, it's definitely possible, although thankfully I never saw a cat go into the piano. But look, probably the cat sits on the floor. And so the point is that the large language model, having trained all these, when you think about it, it's basically trained on the entire volume of human creativity on thought, at least as, you know, as exists on the internet. Again, Wikipedia, Reddit, Quora, all of it, right? And so it's got a pretty good idea based on the context what's likely to follow. And that's really what LLMs are. They're just predicting the probabilistic most likely outcome for the words in a given sentence. We've touched briefly on how parameters are not, in fact, the training data, so I'm going to gloss over this a bit, but just to really drive home this point, right? So LLMs are these probabilistic word associations. The output is indeed novel. It's not pulling from that source data. The source data, like this point cannot be driven home enough. It's never touched. It's never used. It's like a once and done thing. What this practically means then is that there's kind of a vanishingly small, but admittedly, like with most things, math and science, let's call it a small, but admittedly non-zero probability of reproducing the original content of something verbatim. Is it possible? Sure. Is it probable? No, not really, unless you sort of force it to do so, which we'll touch on in a bit. So to kind of give a teaser of where I'm headed with all this, probably it's not capable of copyright infringement. So to recap on copyright law generally, I have no idea how many of you are experts on copyright law, but suffice to say, it protects the original works of authorship for the moment, today, by a human only, for better or worse, which is fixed in a tangible medium of expression, and it grants copyright holders a set of exclusive rights, such as derivative works. So if a thing is produced, which more or less is based on some pre-existing work, there's a presumption of copyright infringement to the benefit of the copyright holder. There is, of course, a set of tests for fair use to see whether, in fact, that derivative use is, you know, if that's sufficient, if it does not, in fact, infringe on the copyright. So again, I just want to kind of fly through this for the moment, but we're going to look at the purpose and the character of use. Simply put, is it transformative? Is it sufficiently transformative? Does it add something new, something really of value that the human has created? And also, by the way, is it for profit or is it free? In general, if it's transformative, sufficiently so, and if it's free, then it's probably going to be fair use. We're going to look at the nature of copyrighted work. Fair use and creativity are inversely related. So the more creative a thing is, the less likely it is to be fair use. The more factual it is, the more likely it is. And that might sound a bit convoluted, but the idea is, if something is factual, then almost by definition, it must be fair use, right? It's a fact. Why shouldn't you be able to replicate that? If it's something creative, like an opinion, like an artistic piece, probably not fair use unless some exception applies, right? The amount of substantiality of the proportion used, well, it's got to be fair use, and the proportion used, excuse me, I misspoke. The fair use and the proportion used must be inversely related as well, right? Because the more of it that there is, the less likely it's fair use. The less use, then the more likely there's going to be fair use. So it really looks to the degree, the amount. So you've got some sort of output of AI artwork. The question is, how much was, created by a human or an AI, or likewise, you're copying somebody else's work, how much is yours versus the original artists, and so forth. And finally, we're going to look at the effect on the market of the original artwork. If this new work severely harms the resale value of that original work, that may not be fair use. So keeping this all in mind, then, we can finally start to unpack this big question, right? Is there a violation? Well, let's really kind of walk through the steps of how this works, right? So you've got training data that goes in to produce an LLM model. It then outputs probability engine generated stuff. Well, okay, is it a derivative work? Well, let's think about that. It's been trained on everything on the internet, a lot of which may very well indeed be copyrighted information. So, just to kind of give a hint here, yeah, your article, your software code, your artwork, etc. Yeah, definitely probably went into that training data. This is basically a foregone conclusion. But it's a trick question, right? Because again, the output is from the LLM, not from the training data. So that original source content was never actually used. So unless there's some nuance of copyright law that I have missed, merely scraping the data without actually producing it or reproducing it, I should say, is not on its own sufficient to trigger any sort of copyright infringement claim. And the ultimate question needs to be whether the output itself is indeed derivative, and if so, whether one of the various 4 fair use tests applies. Just a quick note here at the bottom too. This also applies obviously to trade secrets, and in general, we'll touch more on this a bit about privacy, but suffice to say, everything's going into these training models, everything, right? So just something to keep in mind. Earlier we mentioned this idea of being able to do live internet queries. Even in this case, what's happening is the AI chatbot is doing a live internet query, and it takes a few seconds. It's not real time because it has to literally browse the web pages in the background. But even then, it's not pulling the stuff directly from the website. It's routing it back into its LLM and then formulating some output and then spitting out a novel response. So here's the point. Training is once and done, like we said. It's not an ongoing rolling basis thing in perpetuity. Everybody seems to think, I mean, literally everyone I've spoken with seems to think that every time you chat with ChatGPT, it's training it. It's not. Yes, I'm sure that it will eventually be used for the next training iteration cycle, sure, but it's not done on a rolling basis. So you've got the training data and the LLMs generated, and then the training data is effectively discarded, or at least in the sense that it's not used again. So as we said, the internet queries are scraping stuff, putting it back in the LLM, and then outputting some novel result. Look, this isn't to say that there's never any copyright infringement ever. That's totally not what I'm saying, right? So here's an example. Suppose that you're scraping or otherwise just copy pasting, a book or a presentation, maybe a YouTube video, the transcription from a YouTube video, and you use that copyrighted material and you dump it into ChatGPT and you say, hey, pretend that you're a novelist or a professor, whatever, create for me a lecture course for Udemy or whatever, based on this other material, and base it only on this material. In that situation, yes, it's still going to be routing everything through its LLM. So strictly speaking, the output will be unique in terms of the actual word selection and choice, so to speak, but the substantive material is decidedly not unique. It's literally just regurgitating what somebody else produced. So to use an example, it's sort of like if you're in school and you just basically rehash somebody else's academic paper without giving it any new spin, any new kind of input of your own, that's not going to cut it, right? So it's not that there's never going to be copyright infringement, but rather my argument has always been that there should be a general assumption of no infringement unless some exception applies, like here, explicitly targeting some singular source material. So what's the difference here? I mean, okay, because it is a bit confusing, right? So non-internet connected queries are 100% LLM generated output from the prior trained and discarded content. The internet queries, as we said, they're simply searching the internet, spitting everything back into the LLM, or injecting it in rather, I should say, and then spitting out some results, which again is novel. But specifically picking somebody's work and asking ChatGPT or Bard or whatever to then base its output on that singular work, I don't know, that's probably got to fail at least some sort of reasonableness test, if nothing else, right? So I actually did see an example of this. That's why this occurred to me on a startup that I was looking at, where they basically take transcripts from YouTube, they use it to make course material, sort of like Udemy, and I just think that just can't fly. So if there's one sentence takeaway for all this, it's sort of what I alluded to previously, right? There's always going to be a small and sometimes not so small, but definitively, non-zero probability of perfectly or near perfectly replicated content. I know this is confusing, and that's why it's such awesome stuff. This is just the nature of how things are. These two slides are not in your slide deck and the materials rather, because to the point of how quickly things are progressing, I just haven't had a chance to put them in. You may have heard by now that, a week or two ago, I guess, President Biden issued his executive order on all things AI. I did not have time to hash it out and drop it in here. These are kind of the high level takeaways. Even if I could have put it in, we wouldn't have had time to go through it. But I think this is something worth discussing. This is actually very cool. So this is news as of this morning, actually. So YouTube just announced that they are going to require content creators to disclose the use of generative AI or risk removal and other penalties, perhaps the complete deletion of their accounts, I don't know. So it's going to require disclosure. They do have to opt in and check it off so they can, forget to or miss it or just not do it. But crucially, it also allows for people to submit takedown requests for AI generated content. This is pretty big stuff, actually. And crucially, music industry partners too can request the removal of anything that's mimicking a particular artist's works. So for instance, you may have heard a few months ago, there was a hip hop artist, I forget who it was now, whose voice was so perfectly, emulated, mimicked, copied by AI that a reasonable person would absolutely swear that it's the same singer. And of course it wasn't. So yeah, this is all pretty, this is a pretty big deal. And I think it's pretty obvious as to where things are going to be headed. So it's a good moment for a pause. And I throw this in there only because as I said, until November 30th of last year, this would be kind of a quaint little thing to chuckle about. But this isn't a thing to chuckle about anymore. This is very real. And I'm going to just I want you to pause and think about something for a moment. The only thing here, which is currently still science fiction, is an android, which looks totally human-like, right? We don't have that yet. But here's the crazy thing. Remember earlier we discussed how researchers had no idea that AI was going to progress as quickly as it has done just in the past year, right? That's not even the crazy thing. The crazy thing is that AI researchers anticipated that the deployment of AI would have been exactly the inverse to what we've seen, which is to say, first we would have had big kind of lumbering industrial robots, and then we would have had sort of really kind of basic high-level cognition. And finally, we'd have many decades hence, perhaps even a century down the road, we would have finally very deep, low-level human type of cognition. And what's totally mind-blowing is that it's proven to be the exact opposite of that. What we have now is precisely computers that can that can speak like this. Okay, fine, we don't have the physical embodiment of an android yet, but that's relatively trivial. The cognitive capacity is suddenly nearly there, and what was once 10, 20, 30 years down the road, human levels of cognition, is now said to be just 2 to 3 years down the road, if that. So this is really I always get goosebumps when I talk about this because it's not science fiction anymore. That's what's crazy. So let's fly through some things here. So there is a lot to go through, and I want to be mindful of time. So very quickly, the U.S. Copyright Office has indeed suggested sort of, as they say, formal guidance as of March 17th. I'll let you kind of read through this in the materials, but suffice to say, this touches on what we said earlier, right? So we want to see the degree to which a human has actually been involved with the creative AI artworks. We want to see, is it the result of mechanical reproduction, or is it indeed the author's own mental conception? So just something to keep in mind. So let's kind of work through a quick example here, right? So I don't know how many of you have recognized that indeed the imagery in this entire slide deck is produced with the help of AI entirely, specifically Midjourney. So Midjourney, you may have heard of, is arguably the leading image generation tool out there. So let's see if I could get copyright on any of these images. So I was running an experiment a while back. Suppose you use Midjourney to create artwork. It outputs the image. You generate a canvas print, get it framed using Printify, and set up an Etsy store. People start to buy it. Do you have a copyright on that artwork? Am I able to claim copyright for those creations? Well, based on everything that we've said so far, yeah, probably not. Because as it turns out, for better or worse, the US Copyright Office would say that, hey, merely typing in natural language text prompt to generate some sort of artwork, no matter how fantastic and beautiful it is, We're not going to grant copyright to that because a human did not create it, and natural text prompts are not sufficient, doesn't rise sufficiently to the level of creativity to merit copyright protection. I suppose you either agree with that or you don't. So this is kind of interesting. Very weirdly and perhaps a bit embarrassingly, I found myself actually reading through the entire Midjourney terms of service one night. Don't tell my wife. But I found it really quite fascinating because, you know, we all know that obviously at a federal level, there's always going to be grounds to sue end users of, well, in this case, Midjourney without any sort of knowledge or intent of copyright infringement. Okay, fine. But here's what's interesting. So Midjourney has, I think, look, I guess it was paragraph 10, it looks like, limitation of liability and indemnity. So the paragraph, somewhat tongue-in-cheek that it's written, if you knowingly infringe someone else's intellectual property and that costs us, Midjourney, money, we're going to come and find you and collect that money from you. We might also do other stuff like try to get a court to make you pay our attorney's fees. Don't do it. This reminds me of Liam Neeson's character in that movie. I forget what it's called now. But in any event, if this sounds at all familiar, that's because it is actually rather familiar stuff. It's UGC, user-generated content clauses, right? So anything that involves video games or apps that allow the end user to generate content are obviously going to have clauses like this. That's therefore not really an unusual thing, but I do think it's pretty telling that we're seeing this obviously in the case of an AI image generation platform. So pro tip, probably always include a clause like this in your terms of service for anything involving anything at all generated by AI. Quick little self plug here on my website. I do have a set of startup legal toolkits, sort of informative information on my website called Axiomic. You can check it out if you like. Let's continue though. One really great example is Photoshop generative fill. This is staggeringly mind-blowing stuff. I suspect many of you have probably seen this, but if not, then maybe your brain is sort of melting here trying to process what you're seeing, because everything in the square, if it looks familiar, that's because it is. These were very famous music album covers, right? That perhaps helps trigger the memory that you've almost got about these, if it wasn't immediately obvious. And what's happening now is that Photoshop can actually take an image fragment and on its own generate the surrounding context of that image. I mean, this is just magic, right? And so obviously the question is this going to be, you know, could you get copyright protection for this? Look, surely not. Very briefly, let's talk about patents. Again, I want to be mindful of time. Looks like I have 18 minutes to go here-ish. Patents. So not much to say here other than that there was a court decision, Thaler v. Vidal, inventor must be human. Okay, probably no surprise there. However, it turns out that in South Africa, AI-generated inventions can be granted patents. So if you want to use ChatGPT to write yourself a patent, probably do it in South Africa. What about code? So we touched earlier on a bit about how products, for instance, like Microsoft Copilot now are enabling you to leverage the power of generative AI like ChatGPT or anything else besides inside of the development environment. So you can literally use AI to whip up code for you. Just a quick comment on this, that probably be really mindful of this, because if the output code is itself based on open source licenses, well, kind of by analogy to what we just discussed about copyright generally, right? It could very well then be the case that the final product is itself bound to the open source license and not your own. So this is, let's say, a very delicate balancing act that needs to be very carefully weighed and understood. All right, let's dive into EU and the EU and their approach to AI. So you may have heard this funny thing earlier in the spring. Italy banned briefly ChatGPT. Turns out it was due, as far as I understand it anyway, it was due mostly to kind of practical, I think, it wasn't sufficiently described the various GDPR kind of opt-out options. And anyway, it was remedied and put back up. But it does show that any country, for any reason or another, could very easily ban this stuff. I mean, I'm very surprised, to be honest, that more countries haven't yet tried to ban it. I don't know how they would, but I'm surprised we haven't seen more of this yet. I'm actually rather a fan of the EU AI Act's proposed kind of tiered system. I think it's pretty good. In the interest of time, I'm not going to rattle through each tier here. You can read this in front of you in the materials, but I will just kind of point out one thing that does strike me as really alarming. And either this chart that's been pretty widely circulated by now is either not detailed enough, but I think that second tier from the bottom, Article 52, is, I'm very concerned by the fact that this includes the likes of chatbots and deep fakes and so forth, because these are the things that literally have the capability of faking and hijacking human communication. And I believe it was Yuval Noah Harari who said that what is democracy? How did he put it? What is democracy but communication? And if AI is able to hack our communication capabilities by faking content, and what better way to do it than with chatbots with a deep fake face of who knows who, that's to me really alarming. So I'm kind of surprised that's not higher up the list there. There will be fines. Last I heard, 6% of global revenue for non-compliance. Let's keep flying through here. We can come back if there's any questions on these particular points. Rather to my point about copyright infringement generally, look, Japan actually did say the same. Training data is totally fair game. As of June 5th of 2023, copyrights will not be enforced with AI training data. Boom. And I think this is a really great, well, obviously in a self-serving way, this sort of validates what I've been effectively arguing so far and for quite some time, but I'm curious to see whether other countries kind of follow suit. Speaking of suit, that pun was not intended. Obviously, let's talk about some of the lawsuits against OpenAI. So this one's so convoluted, it took me a while to summarize it, but suffice to say, I think this is the very first lawsuit against OpenAI. Some person sued OpenAI because they were claiming defamation and so forth. The real lawsuit, though, was actually by Second Amendment Foundation against the Washington Attorney General, and it was about something that a journalist was researching. The point is the plaintiff had no relation at all to any of this, so I don't even know if it was tossed out, but it was kind of amusing, if nothing else, to see that obviously the lawsuits are going to start rolling in, and indeed they are coming in a big way, right? So there was the authors suing OpenAI. And again, we see that there's this big question of copyright infringement, right? And I actually really like these quotes. This is why I pulled these out. Obviously, you know, the theory that plaintiffs are alleging is you know, if you ask ChatGPT who is the greatest basketball player of all time, and if ChatGPT says Michael Jordan, that's somehow an infringement just because their content went into the training data. It just doesn't really seem to, it just doesn't feel right somehow, right? And the point is, there needs to be some sort of substantial similarity, right, in order for there to actually be copyright infringement. I think so. So this kind of gives me some hope that courts are going to really go in this decision in this direction that I think is so important. And I'll kind of bring this all full circle at the end to explain to you not just why I care about this view, which I think is somewhat unpopular, if I'm honest, but why I think it's so crucially important. Now, and I guess we're there now, actually. Here's the point, right? So as we mentioned a bit ago, we are going to have this future of walking, talking machines. This is, you cannot stop technological process. We've seen this since the beginning of time. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? But if we don't have a proper framework in place for how to handle things like copyright infringement output by AI, or whether indeed AI itself can get its own copyright protection or patents and so forth, which obviously leads to the logical endgame of the idea of AI rights. And yes, I am again looping this back to this brilliant bit of science fiction from 30 years ago with Star Trek, right? This idea, if we don't build this proper framework, then we are literally setting ourselves up for a future of walking, talking copyright infringement machines. And this is not a good outcome. So we really need to get this straight from the beginning, and frankly, before things really fall apart very quickly. So let's tie things up then with how to integrate ChatGPT with your law practice. You can blame me if I'm wrong here. I strongly believe this. We'll see. And even if I am wrong, it's not going to be by much more than a couple of years at most. But yeah, I think any law practice not fully embracing AI will indeed be dead or dying by 2025. And by the way, not just law practices. I think this is going to be true for any business, as we said at the beginning of this talk.
This
So
might
what
be a
not?
chance to just bring up one question that came up, Mark, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
Since we're at about 10 minutes. But the question was earlier in the program, someone asked, is there a fee to use the more recent versions of ChatGPT, which is an interesting question. And just now someone else asked, can you touch a little bit on how attorneys can use AI, i.e. ChatGPT, for creating legal documents? And does he have experience with case law AI or the AI products being offered?
That's exactly where we're going with this.
Great, perfect.
So I'm sure many of you then have heard about this lawsuit, Mata v. Avianca. This was the example in New York. I'm not going to belabor this because I'm sure you've all heard this by now, but the lawyer in New York who used ChatGPT and pulled up a bunch of bogus case citations. He was not aware of the possibility that the content could be false. So look, in general, obviously, just treat ChatGPT like any other tool. It is kind of, as Spidey always said, with great power comes great responsibility. Tools are always going to be misused, whether it's ChatGPT, the internet itself, or indeed Westlaw, Lexis, and so forth. As I like to say, don't be a fool. You're the lawyer, not the tool. So just use a bit of common sense. That said, generative AI like ChatGPT, it is really great, except when it isn't. And the point is it's sort of like, for those of you who have a Tesla with autopilot or have read about it in the news, it's kind of like that. It's sufficiently good that it makes it really easy to be careless. And that's what makes it actually quite dangerous. One quick kind of footnote here is, due to the multiplicative effect of ChatGPT and indeed AI generally on one's productivity, I suspect this is probably going to be the final nail in the coffin for billable hours. Just something to think about, because if you can get done in, say, half an hour, what would have otherwise taken you 4 or 5 hours, yeah, suddenly that business model is not going to hold very much water. Again, in the interest of time, let me gloss over a lot of this, but suffice to say, there's a lot of concern now in Texas, for instance. There needs to be a attestation by attorneys that indeed they were basically the final set of eyeballs. I have a friend who works as a deputy attorney general in Sacramento. They are expressly not allowed to use any sort of AI whatsoever. To the point of the question now, yeah, so you can basically use ChatGPT and other AI platforms to do just about anything, whether it's fundamental legal research, drafting letters to clients. It's really, really good at analyzing the tone of content. I've used it actually to kind of role play, say, for trial prep. And we're going to touch on the privacy concerns here in a moment. Suffice to say, always redact every bit of personally identifiable information, because of course. And that then brings us to everything about ethics. So there are a lot of concerns: bias, discrimination, the misinformation, hallucination that we talked about. So here's the key, right? The ABA rules have said this forever. We've got to be competent, right? AI is an assistant, not a lawyer. So, you think about using Westlaw or Lexis and all the various keyword and Boolean searches, which is an admittedly vastly more complicated thing to do well, to do right. But you've got to be competent with that. And likewise, you've got to be competent also with AI. And again, this idea of new technology, this is all assumed by the ABA. So let's kind of fly through this. I get this should indeed be its own course, but let's go through these all kind of one by one. So 1.1 says you've got to be obviously competent in the required skill sets. And there's a comment, crucially, that says you've got to be aware of the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. 1.3 talks about being diligent and being prompt. And there's an implication there, right, which says that technology must be used to balance your workload. Again, this kind of goes back to the analogy from earlier where I suggested, if you didn't use, say, email or indeed any sort of legal research tools online, that's probably going to fall afoul of upholding 1.3. There does need to be reasonable communication, obviously, and this is obviously quite heavily implied. It's not explicit, but probably a good idea to start explaining your use of AI to your clients in engagement letters. Just put something in there if they have an issue with it, or indeed discuss it with them openly, but definitely put it in there. 1.6, confidentiality. So this is obviously a big thing, right? To the point of the question regarding co-counsel from Case Text, yeah, I did actually trial their product. To cut to the chase, I thought it was brilliant, but also no surprise. It's pretty much exactly what I suspected, which is to say, they've got a partnership with OpenAI. They then have their own private instance of ChatGPT-4's LLM. So whenever you send something to Case Text, rather than going to the third party of OpenAI using their API to do so, all your data is going to and remaining strictly on the case text servers. They then use their local legal database, which is queried. So this is not real time. This can take 3, 4, 5 minutes or more. And then it uses the ChatGPT large language model to both properly interpret your question and indeed to properly produce the output. So net, yeah, if you're going to use ChatGPT itself, redact everything that's personally identifiable. Alternatively, to the extent possible, use something like Case Text Co-Counsel, give it a try. They do have a trial. I have no association with them whatsoever, although admittedly, the co-founder was a friend in high school. But apart from that, give them a try. Lexis Plus AI is also rolling out their product, I think this week, actually. Let's see. Rule 3.1, meritorious claims. Yeah, look, obviously, don't be like that lawyer from New York in the Avianca case. Double check. Again, just treat AI like a legal assistant. You've got to be the final set of eyeballs. This shouldn't be rocket science, right? The ABA Resolution 112 from 2019, it's as far back as then, they were kind of anticipating the deployment of AI. And mind you, this was before generative AI, right? This was just AI generally, of which generative AI is a subset. Finally, I think, rules 5.1 and 5.3, lawyers must, of course, supervise AI because, as we said, it's basically an assistant. So, of course, you have to supervise it. This, I think, is one of the coolest things. Again, no time to go through it, but it's in your materials. Give it a read. I thought it'd be pretty fun and pretty meta to get ChatGPT to write its own legal ethics rules. My prompt, as you can see, was, can you please produce a fictitious rule about the use of AI like LLMs, like ChatGPT, give it appropriate headings and section numbers to fit into a logically coherent place in the existing rules and make sure it's suitably detailed and so on. So I actually shared this with a friend of mine, and she said, wow, Mark, this is amazing. You've got to share this with the California Bar. And of course, I told her it was ChatGPT, and her head blew up. So this is pretty neat. So give this a read, see what you think. Oh yeah, I did already mention Lexis Plus AI and Case Text Co-Counsel both. So I think we have about 5 minutes left, if that. Let's just take a moment then. Where are we at generally then as humanity, as a species? I know this sounds like it might be beyond the scope, but it's really, I think, important to close out on this because it brings everything full circle. And why I said I titled this lecture, The Undiscovered Country. This is a true statement of fact. 50% of AI researchers today believe there's a 10% or greater risk that humans go extinct, literally actually extinct, from our inability to control AI. And the issue is, as we discussed earlier, there's a sort of double exponential growth. Not only is the power of AI doubling, or I should say growing exponentially, but so too is its self-learning. So it's like an exponential on top of an exponential, hence the accelerated timeframes that we've talked about. You can kind of review the various points here, from the dangerous to the bad, to the good to the great, but suffice to say, this is a very scary time because, make no mistake, we don't need some sort of Terminator 2 future with a bunch of killing machines around us. We just need superhuman cognition, which by definition will beat us at chess every single time. And in this case, I don't mean the actual board game of chess, but rather, I mean life. Computers have been beating us at chess for a long time now, right? And now they're going to start beating us at life. And if you want any proof of this, just consider, we're still debating who won the elections. And that wouldn't have happened but for the ability to fabricate news. And that was before generative AI and deepfakes were a thing. So just imagine where things are going, right? So as we said, double exponential growth, self-learning. They're already very good at faking sentience. They will be at superhuman cognition. When I wrote this slide deck a few months ago, this slide on this slide deck, I should say, it was said to be less than 10 years. Now it could be even quicker than that. So it's literally a more intelligent alternative life form to humans. So these are kind of the risks, right, that we're facing right now. And the concern is it's not so much of just having a nuclear arms race, but rather we've got AI, which is building AI, right? And that's a lot more risky and scary than humans simply building nukes. That said, let's end on a happy note, right? I think that AI, I've gone on the record many times saying that AI is the greatest, I was going to say technological step change, but really in a sense it's the greatest societal step change in humanity. Admittedly, those of you who heard my podcast, I did used to say this about autonomous vehicles, and I don't take that back then, but now that generative AI is a thing, it easily supersedes that. This makes the Gutenberg press look like nothing. I mean, this is the greatest thing that's happened to humanity. But my concern is, and why I think it's so critical we get this framework right from the beginning, we really do need to temper it before we lose it forever. And, deprive ourselves from all the wondrous innovation and beauty that it can bring, because make no mistake, this is an incredible time to be alive. And let's not lose this. So thank you very much for listening, for watching. I'll take any questions.
Mark, I see one question in the chat that I want to bring up, but I also have a question myself.
Yeah.
How much are these legal AI products, and could a legal assistant use the AI products to assist the attorney? That's maybe an ethical question. And my question is, did we have an opportunity to build values, some kind of universal values into these LLMs and AI products, or if not, do we still have an opportunity?
Okay, wow, there's a lot of good questions there. Hang on, first things first. So, well, also just reading off this, yes, there are fees to use, say, ChatGPT 4, which I forgot to mention is worth doing because in addition to more, better, faster live research, you also get the ability to upload any file type. For example, you can upload a PDF of any document, or indeed you can upload images, photos, whatever you like, and you can actually interact with ChatGPT with those files. And even beyond that, it'll output file results for you that you can then download. It's basically your own data scientist. It's unbelievable. I'm sorry, Nestor, the other question after that, what was it? Sorry, please.
There have been a couple questions about fees, which is interesting. That's one way to regulate in a way, or to interact with the ChatGPT. But are there legal fees for using, fees for using the legal AI products? And could a legal assistant?
Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, case text co-counsel, I think they're pricing 400-ish per month per seat, I believe, which pays for itself if you're going to do more than 3 queries, for which you can pay a la carte. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. So to be honest, I think so. The easy math to decide whether it's worth your while to do it, right? Just do it based on hourly time suck, right? I mean, if you pay $400 a month per seat, and if it lets you get done in 1 hour, it would have taken 6 hours. Obviously, it's a win.
And Mimi, I should ask, we're at the hour. If we want to let people go, but if we're willing to stay and field more questions, maybe we could do that.
Oh, well, there was the
Mimi,
question
is that
about...
the right approach? Or?
Sorry.
Yeah, we can answer some more questions. I just have to start the next program at 4:15.
Okay.
Well, Nestor, there was the question you mentioned about how did you phrase it, about introducing kind of values and so forth? Is that
that was my question? Did we miss an opportunity to build universal values into ChatGPT, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really, really complicated question to answer. I guess my short attempt would be something like this. Yeah, there's a lot of companies that are whose entire mission, for example, Anthropic, they're the makers of Claude. Claude is another competing AI tool. So their whole mission is to make a sort of AI constitution, as it were. And they are trying to infuse it with kind of values and ethics and so forth. My concern, though, is, I'm not going to unpack all this now, obviously, but my concern is that things like values and ethics and what is or isn't offensive or biased or whatever, this is very culture dependent stuff. So I don't know how this is going to be fleshed out across different cultures. I suspect that maybe eventually different countries will be able to kind of fine tune different AI language models to conform with their cultural norms, I guess. This is one of those shruggy face moments. I don't know.
Yep, I got it. The only one that came to mind was truthfulness, right? But if we could agree on that, the hallucinations should not be permissible, but yeah. Great. All right. And so I see what national oversight is in place in the US regarding ethical protections.
Well, so that was one of the slides that I glossed over precisely because there isn't really much, at least not substantively enough yet. There just isn't. I am hopeful that we get, so one thing that's rather surprising that I think, well, yeah, I think it's somewhat surprising is this is the first time I've seen in the technology space where founders of these companies are begging the government for regulation. I mean, this is like literally the last thing that would ever happen, right? Tech company CEOs don't typically ask for regulation, right? So there isn't really anything yet, but they are begging for it precisely for the fears that we outlined, right? That there is tremendous risk for things to go very, very wrong. So I am pretty optimistic we're going to get regulation sooner rather than later. My concern is whether it happens soon enough before things do indeed start to go very wrong.
Great. And with that, I think I will just thank you so much on behalf of everyone in our audience and the Marin County Bar Association. It was a really fascinating program. Thank you so much, Mark.
Excellent, Mark.
Nestor.
Thank you so much. And
It's
thank
been a
you,
pleasure
Nestor.
indeed. Thank you very much for having me.
Hopefully there'll be a part 2.
Always happy to do so.
All right. Thank you all.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.